We left off, you had just started with Senator Dominic.
Yeah, I went to work for Senator Dominic. I wasn't from Colorado. I've never been a member of a party, but, it was an experience. He strangely, looking back on it, couldn't stand Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president, elected vice president, and he wanted to run against him in 1972. And he wanted more national publicity, and I had had a little bit of national experience, and so he hired me. That was my 2 years on Capitol Hill, which is plenty. It was enough. And I learned a lot about, again, the process of dissemination of the news. When you're in the minority on Capitol Hill, in those days you were ignored. Now the minority has equal voice, whether it's the Republicans that control the House, the Democrats have an equal voice with our networks. And it's the same thing in the Senate. The Republicans are the minority, they have an equal voice. And that was all part of what I learned, is how the establishment decides what's important. And it's either based on the majority or some minority member that is usually speaking out of turn with the minority party. It's always, television looks for the unusual, the ones that are rated and have ratings and all that. And if you're unusual, outspoken, you're gonna get attention. If you're just doing your job, forget it. Very hard to get attention.
Where does Senator Dominic fit into that?
He was in the minority. He was a Republican. He was interesting because, for a lot of reasons. He was from Connecticut, but after World War II, flew around the western part of the United States to try to find a state that he wanted to live in, and he decided on Colorado. I've always thought he decided that because he wanted to run for office. He was a handsome, looked like Lee Marvin, the actor, and he was handsome, came from Money, the Dominic and Dominic brokerage firm on Wall Street. He was a lawyer. He had been in Asia during World War II. I'd say his politics in those days were probably fairly conservative. He was not a religious conservative. He was just a conservative, more fiscally, strong military. And the sad thing is, the whole time I worked for him, he was sick. He had lots of problems, and he wasn't going to be running for anything. He ran for, I only spent 2 years there. I was there 69 and 70. And he ran for the Senate in 74 and lost badly to Gary Hart. Shouldn't have run. Had serious physical problems. But that's what I dealt with, interestingly enough, almost from the beginning with him, was his physical problems. And right out of the box, almost the first day, I had a friend who was this is again how it works, who was a producer of the Today Show. She's deceased, but she said, when you get that job, I'll get him on the Today Show right away. And she did. She put him on the Today Show on Tuesday, the Tuesday after the Monday I went to work for him. But his chief of staff tried to stop it, which really was an enlightening moment. And he tried to stop it because he knew he was sick. He also knew that on Tuesday he was going in the hospital. I didn't. They didn't tell me that. And so when I went in on Monday saying, I was pretty proud of myself, Senator, you wanted national publicity, how'd you like to go on the Today Show tomorrow? And the chief of staff stepped in and said, no, he can't go on the Today Show. And I'm thinking, who are you? Senator will tell me if he wants to go on or not. So we had a little bit of a to-do there right out of the box. And I said, if you want me to be your press secretary, you're going to, but the senator overruled his administrative assistant and said, I'll go do that, then I'll go into the hospital. Well, they didn't tell me why he was going to the hospital. And I said, well, we better get that straight. I mean, if you're going to the hospital, we've got an immediate press problem. And they said, well, just tell the press that he's tired and needs a rest after the campaign. And I said, are we sure this is what this is? And it took a while, and I said, you know, they wanted me to call a press conference and tell the press from Colorado this. And I said, this better be the truth. Because if it's not the truth and you send me out there to tell them something that's not the truth, this will be the last time they pay any attention to me. Well, it wasn't the truth. He had a serious heart problem. He did not come back to work for 6 weeks. He was not in good shape, and he really never recovered from that. I was able to tell the press exactly what was wrong with him. And I learned a very important lesson right there, because if there ever is any dispute on whether you're telling the truth and you're in the job of a press secretary, you're toast. You know, no one will ever believe you again.
But you stayed with him for 2 years.
That was a very brief time compared to most press secretaries. Some of them go up there and stay for 30 years. But 2 years was the perfect timing. I really wanted out of there badly. He treated me fine. I mean, he took me to Vietnam with him when he went on a week's tour over there, which was a tremendous education. And actually, I asked him when I went to work for him if he would do that. I knew that he was planning on going to Vietnam. And he said, well, I'll ask the Secretary of Defense if you can go. And he did, and I did go. And that was in 1970, January of 1970. But he was a decent guy. He treated me okay. It's just that he had a lot of problems. And we had a lot of interesting experiences during the time that he was a senator. But, you know, I learned I didn't want to work on Capitol Hill. I mean, it's a different kind of a place.
Now, I think before that, were you with the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy?
No, that's after that.
Oh, it was after that, okay.
I went to the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy through Dominic's office because he had a former aide who worked for Caspar Weinberger in the Office of Management and Budget. At the time, he may have even been the head of the Bureau of the Budget. I can't remember if they had changed the name by then. But she had a friend that was in the Office of Telecommunications Policy as the director. And somehow or another, probably a Dominic social event, she came, and I told her I wanted to leave. I'd had enough of this experience. And she said, well, I've got a friend that's running this thing called the Office of Telecommunications Policy. I'm going to tell him about you. And he called. I went to interview him. He needed somebody to be his not a secretary, but a press officer and a congressional relations man, because it was a tiny little office. It only had 60 people in it. And after a period of time, 2-3 months, he hired me, and I went to work for him there, and I spent 3.5 years working in that office, which was a brand new office that had never been in being before. Used to be, part of its responsibilities was tucked away in the Commerce Department, but this was an office that was physically down the street a block from the White House. But it was of the White House. It was the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy, but a lot of people in the White House didn't want us. And the Federal Communications Commission that we interacted with, which is a separate administrative agency, didn't really want us.
What was the mandate?
The mandate was to represent the president when it came to communications policy, not press policy, telecommunications policy, broadcasting, cable television, satellite delivery, spectrum management. But oddly, you know, years ago when the Federal Communications Commission was set up in the Federal Communications Act of 1934, it was supposed to be an agency that carried out the laws of Congress, even though the White House nominated and had to be approved by the Senate the people that ran the FCC. And in the original FCC, there were 7, there are now 5. But as this often happens over the years, the administrative agencies act like they're a part of the administration instead of the Congress. And so, and they don't really represent the White House. So that in the midst of good government, new government, and all, this little office was created. But one of the problems that everybody inside the White House didn't like the idea, didn't buy off on it, because the Nixon White House in particular, some of the people that worked for him wanted to control the press. They didn't care about communications policy, but Tom Whitehead, his full name was Clay T. Whitehead, we called him Tom, who was only 31, 32 years old when he was the director of this office, kind of conceptualized the idea when he worked inside the White House. And when they looked for a director of it, they couldn't find anybody, and they looked at him and said, why don't you do it? So at a very young age, he had written all the legislation to create the office. He came over and started it and needed to put the staff together. And I, in retrospect, have to say that Tom Whitehead probably had more impact on the communication system in this country today than any one person. And he was responsible for changing the laws on cable television. It's a complicated story, but basically it had been required by the government to basically stop growing for a lot of reasons. And he forced this process so that it began growing again. He was responsible for creating the domestic satellite system. There was no way to use the satellite system when he got involved in it. You could use it to go to London, but you couldn't use it to go from Washington to Los Angeles. And he created the policy that led to the creation of the satellite system. He was responsible for changing the laws regarding broadcasting, and on and on. I mean, probably the biggest impact he had was being a part of a group of people that wanted to break up the AT&T company into smaller companies so that they didn't have such control over the telephone system. They controlled the nationwide microwave system, the telephone system, and not only did they have your local telephone service, they had your long distance service, and they built your telephone through Western Electric. And you had a lot of choice then. You either could have a black or a white phone, and it was a dial phone. And since then, of course, the whole phone business has gone crazy. And I got to slip into that for 3.5 years. It was a very controversial place. We had to appeal to the White House, appeal to the media, appeal to the public at large, and to continually be able to convince people in Congress that Tom Whitehead spoke for the President of the United States. And a lot of people around the President of the United States didn't want him speaking for them. So it was another of the many lessons that I learned about government, the system, and communications, and how that was going to ever change.
Did President Nixon have a lot to do with it? I mean, did he know what your office, was he closely aligned with what your office was doing, or were these his mandates as well?
Well, yes and no. Whenever Tom Whitehead could get to him directly and would talk policy, not politics, he grasped it very quickly and was usually in approval. But down the street a block, Chuck Colson, Ron Ziegler, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, all these people in the process were between Tom Whitehead and the president. Chuck Colson wanted to use the mechanism of government to silence the media when it came to the harsh criticism they would have from time to time of the president. Herb Klein, who was the communications director of the president, was interested in keeping the broadcasters happy, the local broadcasters. So he didn't want anything like cable television to begin to have any kind of power in a community, because he wanted to favor the local broadcasters. And I can go down the list. And Tom Whitehead, without being Pollyannish about it, he understood politics. He wasn't very political. But he really genuinely wanted to change the system and get what we have today, multiple voices. The White House wanted to control the message, and so they would often threaten owners of television stations that if they didn't have a balanced newscast, that they would work to take their licenses away. Well, our whole attitude was, don't take anything away. Add cable, add satellite, add home video, cassette recorders, add anything you can add to it so that everybody can speak. And today people don't even care about this because they can speak. They can create their own website, they can do their own television show and all that stuff. But this was not possible back then. You had no tape recorder at home that you had no camera that you could afford to be able to create your own show. Nobody at the networks would ever talk to you about a television show. And so there was no internet. Just keep talking out that process and you'll see how far we were. And also the government policy toward communications was no growth, no new stations, no new opportunities. And the politics of that's another story, where the broadcasters were powerful, AT&T was powerful, and they could pay for their access. We have that today, but they can't shut down somebody's website today very easily.
Did you find the office being called by the networks? I mean, were they trying to influence what you were doing?
Oh, sure, and that's fine. We got lobbied by everybody, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we, along the way, had to play this game of going to Congress and convincing them that Tom Whitehead spoke for the President of the United States, when you had the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission over here, who was much more political than Tom was, speaking and resenting the fact that he was speaking for the president. It's a very complicated story, but in the end, Tom Whitehead was successful in changing the regulatory system with a lot of people's help. I mean, he didn't do it by himself, but basically moving the process in a direction of multiple voices, multiple channels, and far less control than we had before that.
And also, public television was just also coming into.
They came in.
67.
Public Television Act was 1967.
Right, but it really started It really started during the Nixon administration.
Its first money was $5 million a year in 1969, his first year in office, and it grew to $45 million. I was gone, but it was, I think the last number was $45 million, and now it's $400 million.
Now, how long were you with that office?
3.5 years.
You were there for Watergate?
I was.
Can you talk a little bit about that, being in that at that time?
Yeah, Watergate was a terrible time, because if you were of the Nixon administration, your first instincts were to say, he's right. I mean, I had no reason to know whether he was right or wrong. I had been, I had gotten to know some of these people around the president, and it was not easy. They were rough, some rough stuff. I mean, they weren't very happy with us because we were calling for the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine and all that, and the White House wanted to use the Fairness Doctrine. And this was tense. This was a very tense city. You're right in the middle of the end of the Vietnam War. You're right in the middle of Watergate, and it was tense. I mean, people were losing lives, and Watergate was a great story, and the Washington Post was a powerful newspaper. And so you had that combination, and every day, I mean, I was so interested in the story that I would go down to the Hilton Hotel every night at 10:20 and get my Washington Post for the next day. You couldn't, there's no internet. You couldn't, there was no other way. But I would drive up, get my paper, go home and look at it, because every day a new lead story about Watergate. Well, what it did to us in our little world was it shut us down. Nothing was going to clear the White House during that time period, especially in 73. 73 when the hearings were. 73 and 74 were terrible. Just terrible, because the town it was so terrible that I remember doing something that I've never done in my life. And in August of 1973, I went to Maine for 1 month. 1 month. I've never taken a month off in my life, practically never taken more than a week off. And I remember nothing was happening. So I went away, and we couldn't move legislation. We couldn't move. We had a special report that we were writing on cable television. They didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want it to come out. They were all afraid of what the media would do. The media didn't like it, that they would be more critical, on and on and on. So it was, again, an interesting time, but it was dead in the water. The town was dead in the water during Watergate. And as it turned out, the White House people were doing some very wrong stuff. So, I mean, it's the way democracy works, and it was a very important time for the process. He eventually quit, so he knew he couldn't continue to govern, and so if you're caught up in as a part of the political group, and I was not a political appointee, but they obviously knew that I was not unfriendly at that time. But by the time it was over and we read the transcripts, I couldn't get out of there fast enough.
And where'd you go?
I was out on the street. When I quit in April of 1974, I picked up a job. There's a little newsletter called the Media Report, and I acted as the editor of the Media Report and wrote stories for it at the tune of about $500 a month. That was my first job outside, and it wasn't easy to find a job then. And then at the same time, after a short time, I got picked up by something called CATV Weekly Magazine, and I supplemented my income. I made about $1,000 a month doing that, and I'd write a column every week, and I took the cover shot of a lot of the magazines and reported on television in this town and cable television.
Was that a specific interest of yours?
Well, I wanted to do C-SPAN, and I didn't know the cable television industry other than I'd met them when I'd been in the Office of Telecommunications Policy. And the satellite was launched in April. The first domestic satellite was launched in April of 1974, and then they launched right after that the RCA satellite, which the cable television industry ended up using. So I was, I've learned all this stuff, and I wanted to bring on new ways to watch the news and public affairs, and so I consciously got into writing in the trade publications with the idea that I was going to introduce myself to the business and then try to put something together over time, and it worked. I mean, I wrote for CATV Weekly for about 8 months, and then I transferred over to Cablevision magazine. The CATV Weekly owners weren't interested in what I wanted to do. They knew I wanted to do a network, and that wasn't their interest. So we parted ways, and about a day later, the fellow who put Cablevision magazine together, a guy named Bob Tisch, Titsch, called me and said, "I'd like to have you be my Washington bureau chief, and I know you want to do this network thing. I will support you. I will help you put it together." And that was the first concrete step in absolutely putting it together.
Well, let's go back. When did the idea of C-SPAN come to you?
I don't have an absolute date for you. I would say that the first time I ever put it on paper, and I don't even know where the paper is, I wrote a letter to my old friend at Channel 18 in Lafayette, Indiana, Dick Shively. And I remember suggesting, he owned cable systems through the Midwest. And this was in 1969, and that would have been the year that I went to work in the Office of Telecommunications Policy. No, it would have been the year I went to work for Dominic as his press secretary. And I had learned from being in Dominic's office how the media worked with him. And Colorado had a lot of Washington-based bureaus. And so it was easier for Dominic to talk back to Colorado than it was a lot of others, because there were 3 television stations that had bureaus here. But I saw the dynamic of, they had to record him on film, put it on an airplane, fly it back to Colorado, develop the film, get it on the news. And you couldn't do that in a day unless he was recorded at 8 o'clock in the morning and there was a 2-hour time difference and they could fly it back there. They'd just get it on the air, maybe on the late night stuff. That's how cumbersome it was. And so when I'm in the middle of that, I keep thinking, well, there's got to be a way to get material into these cable systems of public affairs. So I remember writing Dick Shively a letter saying, how about, thinking about, we'll put together a Washington bureau and do things for your cable system. Well, he couldn't have cared less. I mean, he was a wonderful guy and was very helpful to me, but no, that's not going to work. Just not going to work. So the next time that I specifically worked on it is I had the 3.5 years with Tom Whitehead in the Office of Telecommunications Policy. It was in 74, in that time frame when I'm doing the newsletter and I'm writing for the magazine. I eventually go to work for Dick Shively as a consultant, and I would fly back to Indiana. I'm trying to keep myself together and have enough money to live on, and I'm single, and so it's not a big deal. But I flew back to Indiana and would work for him 1 week, and then I'd come back to Washington and do the magazine and the newsletter, and then I'd go back the next week to Indiana. And Dick had this concept. He wanted to build a network. There was no satellite yet. Remember, the Western Union satellite went up in 74, but none of the cable people went on Western Union. They waited till the RCA satellite went up in 75. And so there was a guy in Kansas City who had a over-the-air UHF television station. And he knew Dick, and Dick, they talked about the idea of using cable systems and independent television station, and not using the satellite, but tying everything together through what's called microwave systems. Actually, it's cable microwave system called CARS band, C-A-R-S band, and that stands for, cable frequencies that were used only for cable television. And you build these microwave towers every 30 miles. And he wanted to create something called the Target Network Television, TNT. And I said to him, what I wanted to do was public affairs. And he said, well, public affairs is going to be the least sellable thing that we could do. Nobody cares that much about it. But if you want to do public affairs, you're going to have to do the other things first. You're going to have to build a CARS band microwave system all through the Midwest. And that was just frightening. Target Network Television did get off the ground, and it was a lot of independent stuff. It was really primitive and not very good. Couldn't compete very well with what was on the big networks. But it was the beginning. But I never, I got out of that eventually because flying back and forth to Indiana every week just didn't work. And when I got to work full-time, the newsletter was bought by Bob Tisch, and I continued to do that for a while and write for his magazine. And then I got into this idea it was the first time we ever did anything that led to C-SPAN it was actually right away. Bob raised $15,000 from the cable industry to buy one small camera and one tape recorder and lights. And what we did for them, for $1,000, we would go out and do one interview for an hour and ship the tape to the cable system in San Diego or in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or one of these, whoever was paying the bill. And we were able to put about 10, 15 companies together to underwrite that. Bob called and got that money, and that was the absolute beginning of C-SPAN. It wasn't called that. It was called cable video, and it was a way to show the industry, because the industry did no public affairs, that this kind of thing could be done. The next thing, I'm still working for Bob Tisch, writing a column and reporting and doing photography and all that, and doing these interviews. The next thing was that we got home box office. They had now gone up on the satellite, and I believe it was September of '75, but we had now gotten permission from HBO. They only ran movies at night, that we could have the daytime periodically to do hearings as an experiment. And so we got a guy from Allentown, Pennsylvania, by the name of John Wolson, who had a cable system there, who sent his truck down with he had all kinds of equipment and all that. And we tape recorded a hearing on Capitol Hill, the Commerce Committee hearing with Senator Hollings was the chairman. And we put that up on the satellite on 5 different days, this hearing, as a way to show that we could do this. It's just to show. And you can't understand what it was like if you didn't live back there, because none of this was being done. You had the Watergate hearings on television, but everybody was in that game. And during the Vietnam War, you had the Vietnam War hearings on from only one committee, though. The anti-war committee was J. William Fulbright, and that started out with CBS, and then I think they moved it around to some of the other channels, because these networks were losing too much money by putting this stuff on. But the news people wanted it on, but the owners didn't want it on for very long because it was a loser. And so we had the cable video, and then we did the hearings, and then when that satellite was up there, people started talking about new ideas. And it was then that I was going around to all the cable operators saying, I've got this idea. And everybody was saying, nice, no, nice, no.
What was your actual pitch?
My actual pitch was, if you want to be taken seriously, in some cases I'd say in Washington or in the country, you're going to have to build a base of doing something other than entertainment and sports. Because the way that CBS, NBC, and ABC become powerful and become important was to do news. And I said, you're going to have to, in my opinion, you're going to have to figure out a way to get into this eventually. And the government's not asking you to get into it, so you're not being mandated to do it. Do it before they tell you you have to do it. Do it in long form so that you can establish that you're different. And I got round applause for a big no. I mean, everybody said no, 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 no. Because it cost money and there were no ratings. They could just see no benefit to it. And there wasn't a way to sell commercials around it. So it got lots of no's. And I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was literally fumbling around, going from office to office, scared to death, talking to these big-time cable operators, and just getting a lot of no's. And then in 1977, there was this organization called the CSAE. It was a loosely knit group of 40 cable television executives. It stood for Cable Satellite Access Entity. A terrible name. It didn't matter. It was a group of 40, and almost all men. I think there was one woman in the group. They would meet and invite people to come in and pitch them ideas for programming, because they had the satellite up there. There wasn't much up there as home box office and Showtime and a couple of Channel 17 out of Atlanta. They wanted new ideas. But people were really afraid to spend lots and lots of money. Nothing had been proven. There was no MTV or ESPN or any of that. And I was invited. There was this fellow that ran the CSAE, a guy named Rex Bradley. And he said, we're going to have a meeting Saturday morning, all day. Why don't you come down? He knew he'd said no to me. He said, why don't you come down and pitch the group? So I did. Went down there, stood up in front of him on a Saturday morning, and I pitched him on the idea of doing long form, and we could do our own Washington-based Meet the Press type program, but you could, and they were very polite to me. And at the end of the meeting, two guys came up to me. One of them was Bob Rosencrans, and the other was Ken Gunter, and they were in business together. Bob was the boss, and Ken was the executive vice president, and they said to me, we like your idea. I think we can help you. Let's see if we can put this together. And they owned Madison Square Garden Network, which was one sporting event a night on cable systems only out of Madison Square Garden. And they saw an opportunity to do this in the daytime. And that was the beginning right then of what turned out to be the satellite-delivered C-SPAN.
Now, how were you planning on funding it?
I wasn't. I had no idea. Bob originally said, I'll tell you what, I'll spend $150,000 a year with you, which sounds like nothing now, and it was nothing then. But it was enough. Remember what we did with $15,000? It was enough to begin to think about stuff that could be put on in the daytime. And he said, I'll go out and talk to the cable industry about this, and then I will, I'll raise some money and we'll get on with it. And I was very excited. But about a month later, and I'm in the middle of planning this, and I've told Bob Tisch that I'm going to leave the magazine and do this and all that stuff. Bob called me one day and said, Brian, this isn't working. I've been calling around to people, and they don't really want this. They don't want to pay for it. And he was going to charge something like a penny a month per customer. And so that was it. It was dead. I was sitting at my desk, couldn't believe that the rug had been pulled out from under me, and it was over. And I wasn't going to quit, but it was a big setback. So I went on reporting for Bob Tisch and his magazine Cablevision. And that had been in August of '77. And in October of '77, I'm up in the office of the chairman of the communications subcommittee in the House, named great human being named Lionel Van Deerlin, the Democrat from San Diego. And we always got along, and I interviewed him. He was one of my interviews on tape in 1976 when we were doing cable video. And we're sitting in his office about this close, and right over here was a black and white television set, and on it was the House of Representatives. And it had a split screen, one on the podium and one on the speaker, and terrible picture and all. And I said, what's that? And he said, that's a closed circuit experiment on televising the House. And I said, well, what's the status of it? And he said, we'll probably get around to doing something in a couple months, voting on it. I said, is it going to pass? He said, I don't know. There are a lot of doubters. And so I said, well, what if we put together, cable television industry put together kind of a network, and we would televise all the sessions all day? And he said, I've never thought of that. And I said, well, since they've allowed these small dishes out at these cable systems, we could probably get into 3-4 million homes, and we could televise the whole sessions. They mostly met in the daytime then. And he said, that's a great idea. I said, well, and I'm a journalist. I mean, I'm already stepping over the line, but I'm a journalist. And he said, well, why don't you write me a speech on that? And I said, my first thought was, I'm not sure a journalist should be writing speeches for members of Congress. So I said, well, let me think about it. And I said, how much time do I have? And he said, well, you got a couple months. There's no hurry on this. So I went back to my office, and about 2 hours later, I got a call from him, and he's in the cloakroom, and he said, Brian, you're not going to believe this, but says they're going to debate this right now. And he said, what were those figures you had how many homes can you get into and all that stuff. And I gave it to him, and he walked out on the floor of the House, and that's the first time it ever been publicly suggested, because the members of the House of Representatives were concerned that the commercial networks would control it and wouldn't be very favorable to them. But the commercial networks really didn't want to control it. They didn't want anything to do with it. And neither did public television. Public television they went to public television, they said, no, we don't want to do that. So anyway, they debated and they voted that day to put the House on television. And I picked up the phone immediately to Bob Rosencrantz and I said, why don't we try to reconstitute this group and put this thing together? And that's what happened. It was right then. Everybody loved the idea. We would do a nonprofit network. We put it on the daytime. It's a long story, but he said, well, I'll tell you right away, I'll give you $25,000. I'll write you a check. You can go around to all the different members of the cable community and see if they'll support you and put together a group, and we'll see what we can do. And that's how it started. And I put, before it was over, 22 people gave checks to start up the organization, and that's how it started.
How did you get the name C-SPAN?
I put down 100 names on a piece of paper and chose it. Don't even like it, the name. Wouldn't do it the same way today. There were a couple of things that were already taken. I think my favorite at the time was Cable Satellite Network, CSN, and that was taken. There was an entity that was called that. And I knew that I had to have something like an ABC, NBC, and CBS thing. You had to have the alphabet soup. And I just put down a whole bunch of names, and in the end picked this because they created a name, like C-SPAN.
What did it stand for?
Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network. Just what it is.
And talk about those first days, leading up to that first broadcast on your new network. What did it take to put it together?
Well, I hired one person who came on full time in October of 1978. Her name at the time was Jana Dabrowski, and she's still here at C-SPAN after 34 years. Her name's Jana Fay now. And I basically, the two of us did it. I mean, everything I've ever done in my life requires a significant amount of coaching from others. So in those early years, there were people like John Evans and Bob Rosencrantz, huge help, and Bob Tisch and Ralph Baruch and Russell Carpenter. I can name John Seaman, all these people. These were seasoned business people. I wasn't. And John Evans built the Arlington, Virginia cable system and was a tremendous help. To this day, he's a tremendous help. He's been a terrific board member, been on the board from the very beginning. We used to have our early executive committee meetings in his facility over in Arlington. And we very much needed this joint project, and the Arlington cable system played an incredible role. We ended up going into a building over there in the middle of Arlington, and on the roof was a place to put our microwave tower and to bring the signal off of the Capitol and run it out to our earth station, which was out in the countryside. It's no countryside anymore. It's right out on the Beltway, about 15 miles from the Capitol. But it was a scramble, a real scramble. I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. I had a great deal of commitment to it, and I had a time problem because the House voted in '78 to do it. Then they studied it for a number of months, and then they agreed that they were going to build their own system in the chamber. We weren't going to be allowed to put our cameras in there, and so what I had to do was build an uplink. It was going to cost too much money to rent an uplink, so we found the money and took a little bit of a loan out, wasn't $250,000 loan, and physically built. I was the contractor. I had to get all the permits and everything else and physically build the earth station from Scientific Atlanta. But we were getting tremendous help from Sid Topol, ran Scientific Atlanta. He gave me a heck of a deal. Sold me a transmitter earth station for $314,000, which is the best price I'd ever heard. And we got a piece of land for where we had to put it. We had a lot of problems, though. And I hired a man named Brian Lockman, February 1st of 1979, came on board full time. He, by the way, had been a part of the original production unit that came from Allentown, Pennsylvania in '76, from that cable operator up there, John Walston, to televise the Fritz Hollings hearings on the HBO channel. And when I spotted him then as a very capable guy, I asked him to come full time. So he was the second person that I hired. And he spent the first 15 years with us as operations manager, and then went to work as the president of the Pennsylvania Cable Television Network, which televises the Pennsylvania House, Senate, and Supreme Court in the state. And it's the only state C-SPAN in the country that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and does hearings and all the rest of the stuff. And he's a terrific operator.
Do you think it'll eventually go to other states? Is this
It
something you try to
has.
do?
It has. Yes, it'll go to all states eventually. It's probably in half of them right now. It's rare that they do a full network. They'll televise their House and Senate, but it's rare, and it's hard because it costs more to do it on a statewide basis than it does on a national basis.
Stop for a minute.
They turn.
When you were starting all the technical preparations for this, did you have any contact with the House itself in terms of them setting up their internal system?
Yes, we had a relationship with a couple of important people in the House then. One of them was the assistant to the clerk of the House, Bill Hartnett. Bill, it's a sad story. Bill died about a year after we started at age 44. I didn't know at the time that he had lymphoma. He never told me until one day we were walking past the Capitol, and he said, "I have something to tell you," and he told me that, and a year later he's dead. He was a tremendous guy. There was a congressman by the name of Charlie Rose, and he was very political, and we had some problems. We butted heads. But he was the Speaker of the House's chairman of his broadcasting committee, and in effect was responsible to the Speaker to build the system in the House. Bill did it, Hartnett. He actually bought the equipment and had it put in and supervised that, but Charlie Rose was responsible to Tip O'Neill. And we just had a difference of opinion. I mean, goes back to the whole control thing. So it was not an easy startup from that standpoint, because right after we started, Charlie Rose thought that he could do his own program on the network, wanted to do a weekly kind of a compendium of what went on, and we said no, because the one thing that we knew we had to establish from the very beginning is that we were a journalistic institution, separate and distinct from the Congress, got no money from the Congress or the taxpayer or any government at all, and that this was going to have to stand, as far as the public's concerned, as something that they trusted. And anytime you're dealing with a politician and the media, you're going to have a problem. I lived it. I saw it from all sides, inside, outside, and it was a power thing. And so once we got through the first couple of years, everything settled down.
In that first iteration of it, though, in terms of the technology that they were using and what you could see, how was that controlled? What did that
They
look like?
control everything that we were able to cover, and from the floor of the House only. They don't have any control over any of the other cameras that we have, like in the hearing rooms. But they gave us the end product, and we could either take it or leave it, and wouldn't allow us to put our own cameras in the House chamber. And we've asked periodically for the last 30 years to put our own cameras in, and both Republicans and Democrats say no.
Why is that?
Control. They don't want people to see exactly what's going on there. They'll tell you other reasons, but they don't want the chamber's mostly empty most of the time, which the audience knows. But they don't want reaction shots. They don't want somebody at the podium speaking and then have the ability to see who they're talking to and the reaction. They may not be talking to anybody. They could be just talking to the camera. And it's the most unfortunate part of this whole project.
If you could have cameras in there, what would be your directive?
Directive would be show what's going on. I mean, just show the reaction shots, show the chamber, show exactly what you see when thousands of people walk into the chamber every year, sit up in the gallery and look down and say, gee, there's nobody here. It's such a deception. But it's typical. I mean, I've seen it all my life. That's not unusual. It happens in political campaigns. It happens in press conferences that people have all over the city of Washington. It happens not only with politicians but with think tanks. They want to portray an image that is buttoned down and neat when it isn't. Everybody, television does that all the time.
And how did having cameras in the house influence how did it influence the way people wanted to be perceived, or did it change the way people spoke when they were on camera?
Karen, I have never thought much about that because I know that it's changed something. But the more I worry about that, the more we worry about what the impact is, and I don't want to do that. I've been asked questions for 30 years. What impact do you think you had on the House chamber? And I don't even know. They will tell you, depending on who you talk to and who studies it, that it's had an impact, that it's changed their procedures, that people know when they walk into the chamber that they're speaking to an audience outside of the chamber. My contention has been that the longer we're there, the less they think about it. But they're adults. They have a constituency that they answer to. The town at this stage in its life is about 10% popular in the country. I mean, it's a low ebb. So whatever they think they're doing, it's not working. People want honesty. They want truth. They want to be able to see what's exactly happening. And they don't, and that's why we work hard when there are cameras, just showing it what it is without looking for trouble. In other words, what you wouldn't do if you covered the chamber with our cameras, you wouldn't look for the one person sitting on the floor that's reading a newspaper. That's not what would be after. But if there is a conversation going on between two people, you could watch the conversation, and that happens. They have colloquies all the time, and they have the two different sides, the Democrats and Republicans, that are talking back and forth. It would make it more interesting.
Going back to the first day of broadcast, talk a little about that. Was there any kind of fanfare?
Not much. There was a series of newspaper articles saying House goes on television, nobody cares. I mean, there was an attitude in this town particularly. This does not matter. Why would anybody want to watch the House of Representatives? And the people in power, in the media, didn't give one hoot about it. I mean, it was like, that's not going to work. Nobody's going to watch it. And they really just stood back from it. And you got the silly stories about makeup, red ties, changed hair and all that stuff. But and you got some of that, but very little of it. Very little of it. And that's, again, what media does, I think, which is so misleading, is I remember the first day the Senate went on television in 1986, John Glenn, for some reason, went out on the floor and took a brush and powdered his head from the floor of the Senate, which enabled the networks to all run that and saying, see, that's exactly what it's going to be. He was the only one that did it. It was a stunt. It got him that publicity that night, but it was very misleading. It's been a very serious place for the last 30 years, or since 1986, Senate debate.
What was the first thing people saw that day?
The very first thing they saw was the speaker come in and gavel the chamber in, and then the very first speaker was Al Gore.
Was there any references made to the fact that it was being televised?
Al Gore made a 1-minute speech, and that was what it was all about. That today is a historic day, that kind of thing. Yeah,
And why was he the one that did it? Do you know?
because he wanted to, and he got in line first. I'm actually surprised it wasn't Charlie Rose, but he was determined to, and he got recognition, and he just got up and made the speech.
How many homes was C-SPAN in on that first?
About 3.5 million.
Do you know how many people were watching?
I have no idea. I've never known at any time how many people are watching, and I think that has been a big plus for us. If we worried every day about how many people are watching, there are a lot of things we wouldn't cover. And there are an awful lot of important things that go on in this town that the general press doesn't pay any attention to, mostly television doesn't pay attention to, that have a very powerful impact on the country and how we spend the money, but they don't have enough pizzazz to them.
Talk about programming the network. How did what were your thoughts in terms of what you were going to do?
Well, when we started, we had no plans at all because we had no equipment. We had 4 people. We flipped the switch every day when the house came in and flipped it off when they were out. And we had to figure out a way. I mean, our industry hadn't authorized anything other than carrying that house, and certainly hadn't authorized expenditure of money on equipment. So we had to figure out a way. And in the very, very first 10 months, we didn't do anything. And we didn't own a tape recorder, so we couldn't rerun things. So as the first year progressed, tried to figure out how we could add. I mean, this was going to be a public affairs network, and frankly, no one had paid attention to the public affairs in the name. They just thought this was Congress. We had to figure out a way to get more programming on, and that's when all kinds of bartering started. There was an outfit then called Storer Broadcasting, and a guy named Norm Wege. His office was right across the hall over here then. And in those early days of satellite, Norm had, you go back to the days that I worked for Peter Dominic, when they would film a statement from the senator and put it on an airplane and ship it back. Well, fast forward to 74, 75, the satellite's up there, and local television stations tried to figure out a way, how can I get my Washington coverage back to my stations quickly? Because we then had videotape. Norm Wege noticed that I had a transmission system from, actually was over in the Capitol, out to our satellite uplink 15 miles out on the Beltway. And he came to me and he said, do you have any time when you're not using that? And could we figure out a way to get our stuff up on the satellite into they owned about 6 or 7 television stations. And I said, well, let me think about it. And I came back to him and I said, I'll tell you what, we'll give you time after 6 o'clock at night when we go off on our system. You have to find your own satellite up, like which he did. In exchange, you can have that for free if we can use your tape recorder when you're not. And he said, deal. So then I had to figure out a way to add programming to it. And
so let's stop right there, because we're going to